Hi, I'm Bill Glauber, and welcome to the Journal Sentinel. We're talking education policy, which has ramifications throughout the state. 850,000 public school students, tens of thousands of employees, lots of money involved. The governor has presented his budget, what to do in the next 2 years. The legislature is going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, figure out what to do. There's plenty to talk about, and we have two experts on all things education, especially K through 12 here in Wisconsin. Erin Richards, who covers education for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. She really knows her way around the K through 12 scene. And then we have Alan Borsuk, who used to work for the Journal Sentinel, who is now a senior fellow in law and public policy at Marquette University Law School. Alan writes a weekly column for the Journal Sentinel. It is well read, and he definitely likes to share his opinions and knows quite a lot. Erin, first of all, what was the reaction to the governor's budget proposal? What are you hearing out there?
The governor included a lot of education policy proposals in his budget, as well as his funding proposals. Pretty soon after the budget was released, it was clear to school districts that they were going to lose a significant amount of money that they'd already expected to have continue in this budget. That's a special per pupil allotment of aid. The governor has not continued that in the first year of the budget, which will effectively be a cut for a lot of districts.
But what are you hearing from the educators? Are they freaking out? Are they saying they're going to just cope with this? What are you actually hearing?
No, you're hearing a lot of concern about, we're to the bone. We've used all the tools. We've done Act 10. We've made insurance contribution changes. We're going to have to cut programs. We're going to have to go to referendum and ask our communities to allow us to raise more in property taxes. So there's a lot of concern over funding. On top of that, you've got concern over the governor's voucher expansion proposal, allowing private schools across the state, a lot more of them, to receive public money, allow an unlimited number of kids to go to them if they qualify, if their income qualifies. And that's also causing a lot of unease. As you know, public schools that lose kids to the private sector or independent charter schools, that money flows away from the public schools if the child would have attended them.
Alan, I think on voucher schools, I think the governor actually threaded the needle perfectly. Everybody's angry with his proposal. Tell me about it.
Well, it sounds simple. The city of Milwaukee, which is the state capital of vouchers, won't particularly be affected, but everywhere else in the state, there'll be vouchers available to all private schools. That's the proposal. If the devil is in the details, then they're going to have a difficult time working this out, because the details, the more you look at them, the more you wonder what's going on here. Many of them are unattractive to the private schools that are involved. Restricts the number of kids who can get in. The funding mechanism, which is intended to hold down state spending while taking on a whole expansion of a program. And you say, how do you do that? Well, the answer is, it's not clear to me, because the practical effect is likely to be to drive down the amount of money per student that private schools can get in vouchers, which makes it very unattractive to them, may make it prohibitive to some schools to take part. It's, like almost everything in the budget, shaping up as a mess.
It really is. And Erin, I think the legislature, the Republicans there have said they want to actually add money to public schools. I don't know where they're going to get it, but what are you hearing about that?
Well, I think you've seen the governor say, this isn't the final version. Republicans that control the legislature will probably add some money back into the budget. I think that schools are certainly hopeful that that's going to happen, but we don't have any guarantee yet. We don't know what that would look like. You have at least one key Senate Republican who says, there's just got to be some more money in here for schools, because costs go up every year, costs of doing business go up. We can't hold funding flat and then also take away some funding that they expected to get this year.
And Alan, you know a lot of the folks in the legislature over the years. With Mike Ellis out, and he was, the Senate president, but he was a force to be reckoned with, certainly a public school advocate. Who are the main people that we should be looking at in terms of shaping this budget?
Actually, the main person, my guess at the moment, is Bob Lang. You say, who's Bob Lang? Bob Lang is the longtime, very respected head of the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, nonpartisan. I think everyone's banking on the fact that in May, when the Fiscal Bureau issues its re-estimate of income so far, how things are going for this biennium, it'll be a more cheery view than the one that came out a couple months ago, which shaped this budget, and that'll set the scene for spending more money in the upcoming 2 years. And so they're all banking on more money being made available at that time. But as far as the legislature yourself, I disagree with your premise in that there's so few of them that I know now because there's been so much turnover. And the moderates, you're correct, the moderates or the people who are willing to deal across the aisle, most of them are gone this year on both sides, or are frankly kind of marginalized. Luther Olson, who's been involved in both the Assembly going back a few years and now in the Senate, very much involved in education policy, frankly has been kind of marginalized because they created a second education committee in the state Senate. So Senator Paul Farrow seems to be at the heart of a lot of things. There's a good question there because he may be on the verge of leaving the legislature to become the Waukesha County executive. A variety of state reps who have stepped up this year because the longtime head of the Education Committee on the Republican side also left. So a lot of new faces in leadership positions, new faces just on the committees themselves. And that is kind of worrisome in that there's something to be said for fresh blood, but they also, a lot of them don't know the turf. They just don't.
And also, you
have
have
the
someone like
experience.
Representative Steve Castell, who'd been involved in education.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
For
is
decades,
left.
and really behind the scenes, and quietly, there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes here, sort of smoothing out some things that may, not end up being in the best interest of schools, at least in terms of what they think is going to be best. And with those people gone, it's really kind of a question mark about, what the final budget is going to look like for these guys.
Castell's departure is a very interesting one to me because the more he did and the more he learned, the more he understood both sides of a lot of issues. He became, I wouldn't say a moderate, but nonetheless he just understood more. And that's the kind of thing that I'm worried about now, that will people listen to each other enough to hear what teachers are saying, to hear what school boards are saying, to hear what communities are saying, including the more conservative communities who
And Alan,
are voices that need to be heard.
Alan, the Democrats are basically irrelevent.
Basically irrelevant. They're totally irrelevant.
They're totally irrelevant. And in your coverage of education policy, do you know of a time when one party was completely irrelevant to the process, and how that might affect things?
Well, I do buy the argument that we live in more polarized times. I think some of, with the talk, 40 years ago we used to go out for drinks after business hours, a little bit of that is probably over-romanticized because there's always been partisan bickering. Yeah, it is harder to get a conversation. The Democrats can be counted on to basically oppose everything because everything that's going on is highly partisan Republican ideas, although in a number of cases there's a lot of fighting within the Republican ranks, like school accountability. Nonetheless, the Democrats are pretty much just a solid block in opposition, and that's the most they're going to do.
We'd like to ask you to join us and go online and fire some questions at us. We're more than willing to listen and answer. And we have one from George Mitchell. I guess it's the George Mitchell.
Hello, George.
Hi, George.
And one says, Governor Walker sends many different signals when it comes to K-12 policy. I argue this explains much of the confusion in Madison. What do you say to that in terms of, Walker has been in power now for 4 years. He's had a lot of change, and I guess the question really is there too much change that's going on?
If I may say just a moment of introduction, not everyone may know who George Mitchell is. George Mitchell and his wife Susan were very central to voucher advocacy through the 1990s and up till I think they officially retired about 2 to 3 years ago. I don't remember the exact date. Nonetheless, he keeps his hand in and is very involved. The fact that George Mitchell is not happy with Scott Walker.
If it is the George Mitchell.
I've been in touch with George,
Yeah.
and that I think is representative of his thinking. That in itself is quite interesting because you would think that someone like that would be highly supportive. So Walker has some fires on the conservative side, shall we say, that that he needs to keep in mind. What was the question?
Well, the question specifically is
Yes.
that Walker sends many different signals
Yes.
when it comes to K-12 policy. I argue this explains much of the confusion in Madison.
There is a great deal of confusion in Madison. I referred to it in a piece for the Journal Sentinel recently as the Etch-a-Sketch effect, that every 2 years...
Which I have here.
Yes, every 2 years they take the education scene, turn it over and shake it and have a clean slate and start over again. One of the leading public school advocates said to me about a month ago, he said, if you talk to school officials, public school officials all across the state, the one thing you'd hear the most is, stop the merry-go-round. Just give us a chance to do what we're supposed to be doing now, because you keep changing it every 2 years. There is a great deal of chaos, and if you listen to something like, say, the State Assembly Education Committee hearing on school accountability roughly a month ago now, which went on for, may still be going on.
Oh,
Did it ever end?
Yeah.
It went on for
At
like
least
10 to 12
9,
hours, I
10
believe.
hours.
And I watched about 6 hours of it. It was very frustrating because, just from a listening standpoint, because you thought, there's no momentum in any direction. They're just confused. Everybody was confused.
Erin, and you wrote today about testing, which, that is, again, one of the Etch-a-Sketch very briefly, and I realize it's tough to say anything briefly in education. What is going on with testing? Why is this such a big kerfuffle now? And apparently they want to do a test and then get rid of the test.
Well, and this sort of piggybacks off of the Scott Walker question, too. The governor has expressed, sort of tacit support for this move that Wisconsin and other states went to, which was adopting higher standards for kids in English and math to start with. This has been in the making for 4 to 5 years, and now the tests that will align with these higher standards are about to be administered in Wisconsin for the first time. There's been some logistical hiccups. There's been some technological hiccups.
Yeah, the computers don't work.
There are some technological hangups.
Picky.
That's right. Before these were even known, the governor proposed in his budget to drop the new state test that's aligned with these standards after the first year it's administered, which would be this spring, starting at the end of next month. That's tough for schools because they've spent years now preparing to administer this new exam. They've spent years switching to these higher standards, working on ways to teach kids to do more critical thinking rather than just regurgitate facts. And now there's a movement underway by one of the leading state senators to make sure that the results of these exams don't count for anything in the first year. So we'd have a waiver from these being used for school accountability. We'd have a waiver for these being used to inform teacher evaluations. And so that's going to be another big fight that's sort of layered on top of everything else now in the state. And it's really kind of pulling kids and parents in another direction because nobody knows, are the standards sound? Is the test a good test? We're still sort of, I think a lot of superintendents are in the mode of trying to explain to parents why this is a good move. The standards are higher, the test is sound, it's going to take us some time to adjust, but if the state chooses a different test or tells the Department of Public Instruction to go in a different direction after the first year, who knows? That's another Etch-a-Sketch question.
And Alan, this gets to Common Core, which is the big brawl within the Republican Party and really around the country, and Scott Walker's running for president. So what effect do you think Walker running for president is having on his education policy? Any, or do you think it's there in the background?
I think it's there in the foreground, frankly. I think it's shaping a lot of his positions. There are talking points that he can use going out on the stump in Iowa or New Hampshire or to major donors. The statewide vouchers is a good example of that. The Common Core opposition in general, holding down public school spending and being tight-fisted about taxes. These are all related. I'm not saying he's not serious about them as policy ideas, but they're all related to things he can do out there as a presidential candidate. If I can add one thing to what Erin was saying about testing, there's a much broader context as well that I think 18 months ago, let's say, I would have said testing opposition was kind of a marginalized thing nationwide. There was opposition on the left, there was opposition on the right, but it really wasn't that powerful. At this point, anti-testing sentiment is getting fired up in all 50 states, best as I know, and most important, in Washington, that the Republicans, now that they have control of both houses of Congress, seem to want to get serious about the long-delayed reauthorization, as it's called, the renewal of the federal education law, known for the last 14 years now as No Child Left Behind. And the biggest fight they're having is over testing policy, that No Child Left Behind, when it started in the start of 2002, required testing of basically all kids in America in 3rd through 8th grade and once in high school. Was, as a testing expert I know, they're officially known as psychometricians. He once referred to it as the No Psychometrician Left Unemployed Act. And there was some truth to that there's just testing galore. But opposition is rising so fast, and Wisconsin has joined the movement.
Well, Alan, I have to laugh because, education policy has bedeviled all presidents. And I remember, I think, Alan, you were at the speech. I think Alan and I actually covered the single worst Barack Obama speech ever. And that was a race to the top speech that he delivered in Madison the day after Scott Brown won the Senate race up in Massachusetts, and it looked like Obama's entire policy on health care reform was going to be blown up. And I remember how disinterested Obama was, and I felt so sorry for those kids who were there in the bleachers having to sit through this thing, which brings me up another idea on education policy. It amazes me as just an observer of this, of how you can have all these well-educated people, and when they come together, they can't print anything that actually is understandable in common sense English. And it just sort of, is part of the problem, I think, with what's going on. We have another question. Ralph from Seymour, who apparently is a fan of Erin, he says, "Hi, first congrats to Erin for doing such a great job, and Alan for continuing to write his insightful weekly column. The question is, what will be the impact of yet another expansion of school choice? Has 25 years of this program improved education in Wisconsin?" We would say specifically Milwaukee, because that's where we have the 25 years. Alan, what do you think about that choice question?
Choice, if I had to summarize it, the Milwaukee voucher program and voucher programs around the country, and there are not that many to compare it to, but every time there's been a poll related or any kind of attempt to get reading of what parents think of it, it's very popular. People like it. As an education reform, frankly, I think any fair-minded reading of the unfortunately too limited amount of data that's available is that it hasn't proved too much. There's some studies that say it's improved some degree high school graduation rates, college success rates for kids who go to private high schools. The state standardized test scores now, which the voucher schools have had to take for the last several years, indicate that in some ways the voucher schools are doing worse than MPS, in some ways they're doing slightly better. The reality is, if you boil it all down, they're doing about the same. So you say, this didn't change too much, because nobody's happy with how MPS is doing. We've created more kids going to school getting mediocre grades or worse, and mediocre test scores or worse. You see, that isn't quite what we set out to do in 1990. The voucher advocates were using words like panacea and total game changer and so on. Well, from the standpoint of achievement, that didn't happen. So, did it make things worse? Did it make things better? The answer is not really either.
Erin, what do you think about rolling out choice into the wider state, especially in some of these suburban counties where people, may like their public schools, but then there's others who, if they meet these guidelines in terms of the economics, may want to send their kids to parochial schools on the public dime. What do you think the reaction is going to be in terms of rolling this out to some of these other counties?
Well, certainly the 31 schools statewide that are participating in the limited statewide program right now, for the most part, are quite happy with the program. They've, for the most part, a lot of them have switched kids who were already attending the school as a private pay student to a voucher. They say that's opened up more money to give to scholarships to other kids who might not have qualified for the voucher. Critics say, those kids were already finding a way to attend the private schools without that. But I think that sort of the same thing. You know, parents are happy with the choice. The schools that are participating are quite happy. But the mass rollout to a lot more schools is really going to be, if it passes, and if the funding amount per child isn't very generous, you may have a lot of private schools that don't want to participate. So what's the point of a statewide program that has a big expansion if nobody raises their hand to participate in the expansion?
One of the things you have to understand about the state expansion, and it's limited to 1,000 kids this year, is almost 3/4 of them were, as Erin said, were already in private schools. Whatever you think of that philosophically, and you could have a long debate about that, as a practical matter, it means a kid who was getting $0 in state money is now getting over $7,000 in state money to support his or her education. Well, you can't do that for too many kids without starting to run up the state tab, which Governor Walker obviously understood that, because his proposal basically stops kids who are already in private schools from switching to getting vouchers unless they're going into 9th grade, 1st grade, or kindergarten. And then he's got this funding mechanism that would draw money out of the public school pool, again, to hold down any increase in state spending, which, number one, the public schools are saying, wait, now they're going to take our money from us. Number two, the private schools are realizing that the amount of money that would be involved most likely would be a substantial decline from the amount that's available in vouchers now, that they're not going to get the $7,210 that K-8 students get now. They may get a figure that's being floated around as $5,600. It's possible it could go down way below that. And a third element of the problem is the funding formula as the governor proposed it has so much uncertainty. You wouldn't know if you were running a school until at least into October, and you say, I got to hire teachers in August or whenever, earlier than that. People have to decide whether they're coming. We need to know how much money we're going to have. You won't be able to know, which is to say, I think a lot of the private schools that potentially could get into this, or the handful that are in it now that could get into it more, are looking at it and saying, because they don't know what to think. they're
I think
totally
the other
perplexed.
key is, without knowing the amount of money that they might get, they would have to join or expand the number of seats available. And once you're in, there's a lot more paperwork involved. I mean, part of the reason why people like private
Paperwork in
schools
schools, really?
is that you avoid some of the bureaucracy of the public school system and of all the requirements and T's you have to cross and I's you have to dot. Being in the voucher program means you do have to participate in a lot more of the systematic functions of filling out paperwork, making sure kids are proven to be eligible for the program. A lot of private schools may say that's a lot of work for, I don't know, $2,000 a kid, $3,000 a kid, not enough to cover the cost of their education. Even if it's a supplement, the amount of work that they would have to do that would be extra may not be worth it to them.
Erin, speaking of paperwork, there was a story you did last week about one of the choice groups going and doing freedom of information requests to get addresses, names and addresses of schools, of kids in these schools. What is that story and what's going on?
Sure. So, as you might imagine, the groups that support voucher schools and voucher expansion would like to be able to tap into this potential pool of kids that might want to switch from their public school to a private school. A really good way to get in touch with those people is to get people's names, addresses, and phone numbers. And there's a really good repository for that. It's your public school district. They collect this information. It's called directory information. If you're a parent with a child in a public school, you can opt out of being listed in the directory. But under state law, an individual, media, advocacy group, or otherwise can request the directory information from your school district. So School Choice Wisconsin, which is one of the state voucher advocacy groups, has asked a lot of different public schools around the state, about 30 at this point, to hand over their student contact information. And that's, most districts have said, we understand that this is a legal request. I would say a fair number have complied and turned it over without a fuss, and some others, including Green Bay, have said, we're turning this over to you, but we're making sure all of our parents know that it's going out to them. And you have some districts that have said, we're not going to turn it over to you because we've passed an internal policy that actually further limits this directory data going out, which they can do under state law, but if they haven't passed the law yet, it might be a little
Any
tough.
idea what kind of mailer that might go out with this?
Well, I live in the city of Milwaukee. my youngest child is 27 years old, so I'm not really a target audience at this point. Nonetheless, come spring especially, and sometimes year-round, I get a flood of material in the mail, generally, sometimes dropped off at my door, from all sorts of schools, including public schools, some of which are nowhere near my house, religious schools, charter schools. Everybody's in this. And the broader context for this is that it's a marketing world, and the lifeblood of schools is students, because students are money, students are teachers, students, you know, you don't have students, you don't have a school. And the competition in the city of Milwaukee, and you can see this happening more now statewide, and if there really was an energized state voucher program, it would make it all the more so. The competition to get kids in the door is very intense. The notion that, which was true when I was a kid, I went to the school that I was assigned to go to because that's my neighborhood school, that is taking a much of a back seat to I'm going to pick a school for my kids. Everywhere, and to some degree, especially in a place like the city of Milwaukee. So this is all about marketing.
Yeah.
It's all about getting the word out.
Alan, the neighborhood school, I have the same thing. It's a sign we're old, I guess.
I'm so old.
I have a question from concerned parent. What is the Democrats' solution to the out-of-control spending in MPS per student, yet the fact that that's still, that school district still ranks as one of the worst districts in the United States? This is an age-old question. Is there an answer, Alan?
Everything's fine.
We've got it under control.
Well, I hope introduce an element of reality here. Out of control spending in MPS, I would regard as a myth, frankly, that their per student spending is about in the middle of the pack for Milwaukee area school districts. And it's just not what a lot of people claim, especially if you factor in some of the complications of the MPS budget. The city rec department is there. They provide services, special ed and such. A lot of
Even
people
to-
don't
and even
realize
private
this.
schools.
Two private schools and religious schools. They're required to by law. They provide busing to a lot of private school kids. I mean, so if you really look at how much they're spending per student, it's not so low, but it's not so high. And the whole failure to achieve thing, man, is that complicated, because there's an outfit called the Broad Foundation, generally conservative oriented, I think it's fair to say, very pro-charter school and so on, based in Los Angeles. And they were giving an award for the last bunch of years to the urban district that was making the most gains in the country. I certainly know that MPS was never a candidate for that award, and that's an important matter because they're not making gains. But Broad announced last week, the week before, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, that they're suspending the award because nobody's making progress particularly. And that's a really important and startling and disheartening fact, that progress is very hard to make. So a lot of the voucher schools, a lot of the charter schools, a lot of the MPS schools are all facing the same problem. You've got some excellent schools in all three of those streams in Milwaukee. You've got some schools in all three of those streams that really need major changes. You got a lot of schools that are just struggling. They just aren't doing as well as you'd want. They're not terrible. Teachers are probably working very hard in all of them, but the problems are much broader than just MPS and what should we do.
Erin, I'll give you the last word because you cover MPS quite closely. Give me something, or give us something positive that you see going on in that school district this year.
I think that the hiring of a new, young, and energetic superintendent is probably a good move for them. Coming out from 4 years under Gregory Thornton, who took the job in Baltimore. Darian, from everything I've heard, is visionary and a hard worker. I think she has a lot of work ahead of her to actually try to implement some bigger ideas. And I think that you've started to see the district try to capitalize on some of their strengths. As Alan said, there are some really high-performing and popular schools in Milwaukee. There's some really low performers. There's a lot of mediocrity in between. But you do have some popular schools, like Golda Meir School. They're starting a high school there this year because it's popular and people want to go there. Can they continue that momentum with some of these new programs? I think that's going to be a big question mark, but at least you see some energy toward capitalizing on what is working, and some thawing of some relationships with some competing entities in town to try to really drive some resources to schools that have really had a tough go and have had long time low test scores.
Thank you again, Erin Richards, Alan Borsuk. I'm Bill Glauber, and thanks for joining us to talk about education. And thanks again for tuning in the Journal Sentinel.